The rain wasn't falling anymore. It was attacking. Sheets of water hammered the windshield so hard I could barely see 3 feet ahead. Most drivers had already pulled over, hazard lights blinking like surrendered soldiers along the highway shoulder. But I kept moving, creeping through the flood because I'd learned something in my years doing emergency supply runs during disasters. When nature screams loud enough, the small cries disappear completely. That's what made me notice them. 2 shapes, standing motionless at the edge of the sidewalk where the road was turning into a river. Dogs, soaked through, pressed together, staring down at something I couldn't see. Not running, not seeking shelter, not moving at all. Every survival instinct should have been telling them to flee. Instead, they stood like statues in a flood zone, rain plastering their fur to their ribs, water climbing past their paws. I hit the brakes. The moment my truck stopped, I heard it through the storm's roar. A sound that shouldn't exist in that chaos. Thin, desperate, coming from below the street, crying. I threw open the door and ran toward them, boots splashing through ankle-deep water that was rising with every second. The adult dogs didn't even turn to look at me. Their eyes were locked on the metal storm grate between their feet, ears pinned flat, bodies trembling. When I dropped to my knees beside them and looked down through the rusted bars, my stomach dropped. 3 tiny faces stared up at me from the darkness below. Puppies, paws pressed against the grate, bodies half submerged in filthy water that was swirling higher, climbing their legs, reaching for their chests. They were trapped inside a flooding drain, and the water wasn't slowing down. The mother dog let out a sound I'll never forget. Not a bark, not a howl, but something broken and pleading. She pawed at the grate, trying to lift it, her claws scraping uselessly against metal. The father circled behind her, soaking wet, shaking, but refusing to leave. Then I saw what made my blood turn cold. Rope, thick, deliberate, tied around the grate and anchored to the drainage pipe. Someone had locked them in. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a crime scene. The puppies hadn't wandered into the storm drain by accident. They'd been placed there, trapped there, while their parents were left outside to watch them drown. I had maybe 10 minutes before that drain became a grave. 10 minutes to break through rusted metal that had been deliberately secured. 10 minutes before 3 innocent lives disappeared beneath a flood that someone had weaponized. The rain pounded harder. Thunder cracked overhead, and one of the puppies slipped beneath the surface. This is when I learned that evil doesn't always arrive with fangs and fury. Sometimes it arrives with rope and a storm forecast. Real quick, if this story already has you locked in, hit that subscribe button right now. Because channels that tell stories like this, they disappear if people just watch and leave. Drop a like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. I want to know this message is spreading to people who actually care. Alright, back to what I found in that storm drain. I learned to notice stillness in chaos the hard way. Years of disaster response taught me that the most dangerous situations are the ones where nothing seems to be moving, where animals stop running, where silence replaces panic. That's not peace, that's surrender. And that morning, standing in rising floodwater with 2 desperate parents and 3 drowning puppies, I understood something deeper. Stillness can also mean refusal. These dogs weren't frozen by fear. They were anchored by love. My first disaster response call was 5 years ago. A flash flood in a rural county where families had minutes to evacuate. I was part of a volunteer team checking abandoned properties, making sure no one got left behind. That's when I found the dog. She was sitting in 3 feet of water inside a flooded garage, completely silent, not barking, not swimming, just sitting there, staring at the rising waterline like she was waiting for permission to drown. I waded in and carried her out. She didn't fight, didn't resist. She'd already decided it was over. That's the thing most people don't understand about abandoned animals in disasters. They don't always panic. Sometimes they just stop. Stop hoping someone will come back. Stop believing they matter enough to be saved. When an animal goes silent during a crisis, it's not because they're calm. It's because they've surrendered. I've seen it dozens of times since then. Hurricanes, wildfires, floods. Every time people evacuate, some animals get left behind. Tied to posts, locked in basements, forgotten in the rush to survive. And every time, I've learned to listen to the silence. Because silence means someone's already said goodbye. That's why the storm that morning felt different. The weather warnings had been screaming for hours. Flash flood alerts. Mandatory evacuations. Roads are closing. The city was emptying out. Cars packed with belongings. Families heading to higher ground. Emergency sirens wailing through sheets of rain that turned streets into rivers. I was driving through the chaos with my truck loaded with emergency supplies, scanning for anyone who might need help. The rain was so heavy my wipers couldn't keep up. Water was already climbing the curbs, swallowing storm drains, turning intersections into lakes. That's when I saw them. 2 dogs, standing at the edge of the flooded sidewalk, completely still. Everything in my body went cold. They weren't running, weren't seeking shelter, weren't even trying to escape the water rising around their paws. They just stood there, side by side, soaked to the bone, staring down at the pavement. Every survival instinct should have been screaming at them to move, to find high ground, to run. But they didn't. I slammed the brakes and jumped out into the rain. My boots splashed through water that was already ankle-deep and climbing. As I got closer, I could see them more clearly. A pair of adult dogs, ribs showing through wet fur, ears pinned flat against their skulls. They weren't looking at me. They didn't even turn when I approached. Their eyes were locked on something below them, something I couldn't see yet. And then I heard it, faint, desperate, barely audible under the roar of the storm, crying. The sound was coming from beneath the street. I dropped to my knees beside them and looked down through the metal grate between their feet. My heart stopped. 3 tiny faces stared back at me from the darkness. Puppies, paws pressed against the bars, water swirling around their trembling bodies. They were trapped inside the storm drain, and the water was rising fast. The mother dog let out a broken whimper and pawed at the grate, trying to lift it. The father circled behind her, shaking, but he didn't leave. He didn't run. That's when I understood. They weren't trapped. They were choosing to stay. Even as the flood climbed higher, even as the rain pounded harder, even as their own survival hung in the balance, they refused to abandon their babies. I pressed my face closer to the grate, rain hammering against my back, and that's when I saw how bad it really was. The puppies weren't just trapped. They were drowning in slow motion. The storm drain was filling like a bathtub with no plug. Dirty rainwater swirled around their legs, climbing higher with every second. They were pressed against the back wall of the drain, tiny paws reaching through the bars, mouths open in silent pleas. They couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old. My hands shot to the grate, fingers wrapping around the cold metal. I pulled. Nothing. I pulled harder, muscles straining, boots slipping in the rising water. It wouldn't budge. "Hold on," I shouted down to them. Though I don't know if they could hear me over the storm. "I'm going to get you out." The mother dog pressed her nose against the bars, breathing hard, her whole body shaking. Not from cold, from terror. She understood what was happening. She knew her babies were running out of time. The father stood rigid beside me, eyes darting between the drain and the street, like he was calculating odds. weighing options. But his paws stayed planted. He wasn't leaving. They weren't frozen by fear. They were standing guard, keeping watch, refusing to let their babies die alone. I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands and dialed emergency services. The line rang 4 times before someone picked up. 911, what's your emergency? I've got 3 puppies trapped in a storm drain on Morrison Street near the highway, I said, words tumbling out fast. The water's rising. They're going to drown if someone doesn't get here now. Static crackled on the line. Sir, we're experiencing an extremely high call volume due to the flooding. Animal control is... This isn't an animal control situation. I cut in, voice sharp. This is a rescue. They're drowning. Right now. I understand, sir. But we have multiple. A sound cut through the storm. A desperate, choking whimper. I looked down. One of the puppies had slipped. The water had climbed past his chest, and he was struggling to keep his nose above the surface. His siblings pressed against him, trying to hold him up, but they were all so small, so weak. I don't have time for this, I said into the phone. Send whoever you can. Morrison and Highway 12. Storm drain. I hung up and dropped back to my knees, mind racing. The water was moving faster than I'd thought. It wasn't just rainwater anymore. It was runoff from the entire neighborhood, all of it funneling into the drainage system, all of it pouring into this one trap where 3 helpless lives were fighting for air. The puppy went under, just for a second, maybe 2. But when his head broke the surface again, his eyes were wide with panic, his tiny body convulsing as he coughed up dirty water. No, 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 I whispered, clawing at the grate again. My fingers scraped against rust and metal, searching for any weakness, any gap. The mother dog started barking, sharp, frantic, desperate. She was watching her baby drown, and there was nothing she could do. The father nudged my arm with his nose, hard, then looked toward my truck. He was telling me to do something, anything. I had maybe 5 minutes before the water reached their mouths. Maybe 3 before they were too exhausted to keep their heads up. This wasn't about saving dogs anymore. It was about seconds, and I was running out of them. I ran to my truck, boots pounding through water that was now mid-calf deep. My emergency kit was in the back, crowbar, bolt cutters, rope, first aid supplies. Tools I'd collected over years of disaster work, never imagining I'd need them for something like this. I grabbed the crowbar and sprinted back to the drain. The puppies were still fighting. Barely. Their cries had turned weaker, more tired. The water was at their chins now. I jammed the crowbar under the edge of the grate and threw my weight against it. Metal groaned. The mother dog barked encouragement, pacing back and forth. The father watched with eyes that held something I can only describe as desperate hope. The grate shifted, just slightly, just enough to make me think I had a chance. I repositioned the crowbar, searching for better leverage, and that's when I saw it. Rope, thick, weathered, deliberately tied. It was wound around the grate's frame and anchored to the drainage pipe below, pulled tight and knotted multiple times. Professional. Intentional. My hands froze on the crowbar. This wasn't rust. This wasn't age. This wasn't the grate getting stuck from years of debris. Someone had tied it shut. The realization hit me like cold water. I knelt down, fingers tracing the rope, following it around the metal bars. 3 separate knots. Heavy-duty cord. The kind you use when you want to make sure something stays closed. When you want to make sure something stays trapped. My stomach turned over. The puppies hadn't wandered into this drain by accident. They hadn't fallen through a gap or gotten lost during the storm. They'd been placed here, locked in, left to die. I looked up at the 2 adult dogs standing guard in the rising flood. Their matted fur, their visible ribs, The way they refused to leave despite the water climbing past their legs. They hadn't been separated from their babies by the disaster. They'd been separated by someone who wanted them gone. The storm wasn't the killer. It was the weapon. "Who did this to you?" I whispered, but the dogs just stared at me with eyes that had seen too much, endured too much. Thunder cracked overhead. Rain pounded harder. And suddenly this wasn't a rescue operation anymore. This was a crime scene. Someone had looked at this family, these parents, these babies, and decided they were disposable. Had waited for a storm forecast. Had tied the puppies in a drain where they drowned slowly while their parents watched helplessly from above. Had walked away hoping the flood would erase the evidence. Rage burned through my chest, hot and sharp, but I forced it down. I didn't have time for anger. The water was still rising. The puppies were still drowning. Justice could wait. Survival couldn't. I grabbed my phone again and called 911 back. "This is Kelvin Rodriguez. I called about the storm drain on Morrison Street. I need to report." I steadied my voice. "I need to report animal cruelty. This isn't an accident. Someone tied these puppies in here. They're locked in." The dispatcher's tone changed immediately. "Can you confirm that, sir?" "I'm looking at the rope right now. 3 knots. Intentional. These dogs were left here to drown. Officers are being dispatched to your location. Do not touch anything that could be evidence." I looked down at the puppies. One of them slipped under the water again. "Ma'am, with all due respect, evidence doesn't matter if they're dead. I'm getting them out." I hung up before she could respond. The crowbar felt heavier in my hands now. Heavier with the weight of what I knew. This wasn't nature's cruelty. This was human evil dressed up as disaster. And I had minutes to undo it. Listen, if you're still here and you haven't subscribed, I need you to ask yourself why. These dogs refused to abandon each other in a literal flood, and you can't click a button? Subscribe right now. Like this video. Share it with someone who'd stop their car in a storm. Comment where you're from. Because stories like this only survive if people like you decide they matter. Alright, here's what happened next that absolutely wrecked me. The animal control officer arrived 20 minutes after the rescue, clipboard in hand, radio crackling with dispatch calls. Her name was Sandra, and she'd been doing this job long enough that nothing surprised her anymore. Except this did. She crouched beside the grate, examining the rope still tied around the bars, her jaw tightening with each passing second. "This was deliberate," she said quietly, more to herself than to me. I was sitting on the curb with the puppies wrapped in blankets from my truck, watching the parents hover over them like they still couldn't believe they were safe. The mother kept licking their faces, counting them over and over. The father stood guard, eyes scanning the street like he was waiting for the danger to come back. "I figured that much," I said. "Who does this?" Sandra pulled out her phone, took photos of the rope, the drain, the dogs. Then she ran a scanner over the mother's shoulder. A microchip reader. It beeped. Her expression changed. "Oh no." "What?" She turned the scanner toward me so I could see the screen. "A registration number. An address. A name." "I know this breeder," Sandra said, her voice hard. "We've been trying to shut him down for 2 years." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" She stood up, rain still falling around us, and pulled up something on her phone. Case files, photos, documentation. "Marcus Holloway, backyard breeder operating out of a property on the east side. We've cited him multiple times for animal cruelty, overcrowding, unsanitary conditions. Last month, a judge finally ordered him to surrender all his dogs. So he did this instead?" Sandra's eyes met mine, and I saw the anger burning there. He didn't want to give them up, didn't want to pay the fines. And he definitely didn't want us finding evidence of how bad things really were. She gestured toward the puppies. These 3 were probably from his last litter. The parents were breeding stock he couldn't sell. When the court order came through, he had a choice: hand them over or make them disappear. And he chose the storm. He chose the storm, Sandra confirmed. Tie the puppies in a drain that's about to flood. Leave the parents outside so they can't interfere. Wait for the water to do the work. By the time anyone finds them, if anyone finds them, it looks like a tragedy, not a crime. I felt rage burn through my chest, hot and sharp. He tried to drown them. He tried to erase them, Sandra corrected, along with any evidence that they existed. No dogs, no case, no consequences. I looked at the mother dog, still trembling, still checking on her babies. She'd stood in rising water, watching them drown, unable to reach them. The father had refused to leave even as the flood threatened to take him too. They'd been sentenced to death by someone who saw them as problems to eliminate. What happens now? I asked. Sandra's expression hardened. Now we make sure he doesn't get away with it. She radioed dispatch, requesting backup and a warrant. Then she turned to the dogs, her voice softening just slightly. You're safe now, she told them. Though I don't think she was really talking to the dogs. I think she was making herself a promise. They weren't forgotten. They were silenced. But silence doesn't last when someone refuses to stop listening. And I wasn't about to stop listening now. I sprinted back to my truck, boots pounding through water that was now mid-calf deep. My emergency kit was in the bed: crowbar, bolt cutters, rope, a metal pry bar I'd used to pull debris off roads. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the pry bar twice. When I got back to the drain, the water had climbed another 2 inches. The puppies were pressed against the highest corner they could reach, necks craned upward, noses barely above the surface. I jammed the pry bar under the edge of the grate and threw my full weight against it. Metal groaned. The bar slipped. I repositioned and tried again. Nothing. Come on, I growled, pushing harder, feeling the strain in my shoulders, my back. The mother dog was pacing now, circling the grate, whining continuously. The father stood frozen, watching me with eyes that held something I couldn't name. Not hope, something heavier than that. Trust. I wedged the bar deeper and pulled with everything I had. The grate shifted, maybe an inch, maybe less. Not enough. The rope was holding it down, anchored somewhere inside the drain system. I couldn't see where it led, couldn't reach it from above. Thunder cracked overhead, and the rain somehow fell harder. One of the puppies went under. Not the weak one this time, a different one. She disappeared beneath the brown, churning water, and for 3 seconds, 3 eternal seconds, she didn't come back up. No! I shouted, dropping to my stomach on the flooded pavement, reaching my arm through the bars as far as it would go. My fingers brushed against wet fur. I stretched further, shoulder jamming against metal, and managed to grab her scruff. I pulled her head above water. She gasped, coughing, her little body convulsing. But I couldn't lift her out. The bars were too narrow. My arm was too thick. And the moment I let go, she'd sink again. My phone buzzed. I pulled it out with my free hand, still holding the puppy's head up. Emergency services. Delayed minimum 30 minutes due to road closures. Fire department en route but no ETA. 30 minutes. These puppies had maybe 5. The water was at their chins now. They were standing on their back legs, front paws scrabbling against the metal, using every ounce of strength they had left just to breathe. I looked down into the drain, calculating. The opening was wide enough. If I could break the grate, or if I removed it and went down there myself. But the water was rushing now. I could see it swirling, pulling, draining toward somewhere deeper in the system. If I went down there and lost my footing, I wouldn't just fail to save them. I'd drown with them. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were numb from the cold water. Every logical part of my brain was screaming at me to wait for professionals, to not risk my life for animals I didn't know. But then I looked at the parents. The mother was staring at me with an intensity that cut through the storm. Her body was trembling, soaked, exhausted. She could leave. The water wasn't deep enough to trap her. She could run to safety right now. She didn't move. The father stepped closer to me, so close our shoulders almost touched. He wasn't running either. They were staying, even if it meant dying here. Another puppy went under, came up, went under again. The mother let out a sound that didn't belong in this world. A howl of pure anguish, of a parent watching their child slip away. I made my decision. I grabbed the pry bar, positioned it under the weakest point of the grate, and slammed it down with everything I had left. The metal shrieked, bent, started to give way. I wasn't thinking about heroism. I was thinking about not being able to live with myself if I walked away. The water kept rising, and I kept fighting. The metal rod bent. Not much, maybe an inch, but it was enough to feel the grate start to give way. I repositioned my grip, planted my feet in the rushing water, and slammed the rod down again with everything I had. The sound of screeching metal cut through the storm. The mother dog's barking intensified. The father moved closer, his body tense, eyes locked on the grate. They knew I was close. One more hit. The rusted bars groaned and twisted. I threw the rod aside and grabbed the edge of the grate with both hands, pulling with every ounce of strength left in my body. The grate lifted, just enough. I wrenched it to the side, and the opening yawned wide. A dark mouth filled with swirling, filthy water. The puppies were barely visible now, their heads bobbing just above the surface, eyes wide and terrified. The water had reached their chins. I didn't think. I just moved. I plunged my arms into the freezing water, reaching down into the darkness. My fingers found fur, wet, cold, trembling. I grabbed hold and pulled. The first puppy came up gasping, water streaming from his nose and mouth. I lifted him out and placed him on the pavement. The mother rushed forward immediately, licking him frantically, checking him, whimpering. I dove back in. The second puppy was farther back, pressed against the drain wall. I had to lean in deeper, my chest pressed against the edge of the opening, arms stretched as far as they'd go. My fingers wrapped around tiny ribs and I pulled her free. 2 down, 1 to go. The water was still rising. I could hear it rushing through the pipes, feel it pushing against my arms. I reached in one more time. The third puppy had gone under. My heart stopped. I swept my hands through the murky water, blind, desperate, searching for any sign of him. My fingers brushed against something soft. I grabbed and pulled. He came up limp. No coughing, no crying, just small and still in my hands. No, I breathed. Come on, come on. I laid him on the pavement and pressed gently on his chest. Once, twice. The mother dog stood over me, her body rigid, eyes fixed on her baby. The father let out a low, broken sound. I pressed again. The puppy convulsed. Water poured from his mouth. And then, he gasped. Tiny, rattling breath. Then another. His eyes blinked open. His paws twitched. He was alive. The mother dropped to the ground beside him and started licking him with desperate intensity, as if she could warm him back to life with her tongue alone. The father circled them both, his tail finally moving, not wagging, but trembling with relief. Behind me, sirens wailed in the distance. Red and blue lights cut through the rain. I sat back on the flooded pavement, rain pouring down my face, chest heaving, hands shaking. All 3 puppies were out. All 3 were breathing. The family pressed together in a tight huddle. Mother, father, and their babies. Soaked, exhausted, but alive. The parents didn't celebrate. They didn't relax. Their eyes stayed alert, ears swiveling, bodies positioned protectively around their puppies. Because they knew something I was only beginning to understand. Survival wasn't the same as safety. They'd been rescued from the water. But whoever had put them there was still out in the world. And until that threat was gone, their nightmare wasn't over. The storm was still raging when I pulled the last puppy from the drain. But inside that small circle where we all huddled together, everything went quiet. The mother rushed forward the second I set the 3rd puppy on the pavement. She licked frantically at their faces, checking each one, making sounds I'd never heard a dog make before. Part whimper, part cry, pure relief mixed with disbelief. The father pressed his body against all of them, forming a protective wall with his own soaking fur. His legs were shaking so badly he could barely stand, but he held his position. He wasn't letting anything else touch his family. All 3 puppies were alive, trembling, coughing up dirty water, covered in grime, but alive. I sat back on the flooded pavement, rain pouring down my face, chest heaving, hands still shaking from adrenaline. My arms ached, my lungs burned, but I couldn't stop watching them. The way the mother kept circling her babies, counting them over and over like she couldn't believe they were all there. The way the father finally allowed himself to collapse beside them, exhausted but unbroken. The way the puppies pressed into their parents, seeking warmth, seeking safety, seeking the love that had refused to abandon them. They weren't just a rescue. They were a family that had survived the unthinkable together. Sirens cut through the storm's roar. Red and blue lights reflected off the flooded street as 2 animal control vehicles and a police car pulled up. Officers jumped out, radios crackling, flashlights cutting through the rain. "You the one who called it in?" a female officer asked, jogging toward me. I nodded, still catching my breath. 3 puppies. Storm drain. Someone tied the grate shut. Her expression shifted from concern to something darker. Tied it. With rope. I pointed to the grate I'd torn loose, now lying beside the drain. Deliberately locked them in. Left the parents outside to watch them drown. The officer knelt down, examining the rope still tied to the drainage pipe. Another officer took photos. A third started checking the dogs, speaking softly to the mother who wouldn't let anyone touch her puppies. "We've been looking for these dogs," one of the animal control officers said quietly, pulling up something on her tablet. "Backyard breeder. Repeat violations. He was ordered to surrender them last week." My stomach turned. So instead he tried to make them disappear. Her voice was flat, professional, but I could hear the fury underneath. Thought the flood would do his dirty work. The truth spread through the group like ice water. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't an accident. This was attempted murder disguised as a natural disaster. As they loaded the family carefully into a rescue vehicle, all 5 together, because no one had the heart to separate them, I stood in the rain and felt something crack open inside my chest. These dogs hadn't just survived a flood. They'd survived being treated like garbage, being discarded, being sentenced to death by someone who was supposed to care for them. But they'd survived because they refused to give up on each other. The mother had stayed when she could have run. The father had guarded when he could have fled. And somehow, through rain and rising water and human cruelty, love had been stronger than the storm. The vehicle pulled away, red taillights disappearing into the rain. I stood there long after they were gone, water rushing past my boots, and realized something I'd carry with me forever. Rescue isn't just about saving lives. It's about proving that someone cares when the whole world says you're disposable. 3 weeks after the flood, I visited them at the foster home. The address led me to a quiet street on the east side of town, far from storm drains and rising water. A woman named Sarah had taken them in, all 5 of them together. When animal control realized what had happened, that these dogs had survived deliberate cruelty and refused to abandon each other, they made an exception to their usual policy. The family would stay together. Sarah opened the door with a warm smile. "You must be Kelvin. Come in. They've been waiting for you." I didn't know what to expect. Part of me worried I'd see the same terrified animals I'd pulled from that drain, still traumatized, still broken. But the moment I stepped into the living room, 3 puppies came bounding toward me. Not crawling, not limping, bounding. Their fur was clean and fluffy now, golden brown and soft. Their eyes were bright. Their tails wagged so hard their entire back ends wiggled. They jumped at my legs, tiny paws scrabbling for attention, making those high-pitched puppy sounds that meant pure, uncomplicated joy. I knelt down and they swarmed me, licking my hands, climbing into my lap, completely fearless. Behind them, the mother and father sat side by side on a dog bed near the window, watching. The mother's ribs didn't show anymore. Her coat had regained its shine. But her eyes hadn't changed. They still carried that depth, that knowing. She stood slowly and walked over to me, her movements calm and deliberate. When she reached me, she pressed her head against my chest and held it there. No jumping, no barking, just that quiet, steady pressure. "Thank you." I felt my throat tighten. I wrapped my arms around her and buried my face in her fur. "You saved them," I whispered. "Not me. You." The father joined us then, sitting beside his mate, leaning against my shoulder. The puppies tumbled around our feet, play fighting and chewing on each other's ears, completely unaware of how close they'd come to never having this moment. Sarah handed me a cup of coffee and sat down on the couch. "They're doing incredibly well," she said. "The vet said the puppies show no signs of lasting trauma. They're healthy, social, ready for adoption soon." "And the parents?" She smiled. "They're the most devoted dogs I've ever fostered. They still check on the puppies constantly, making sure they're eating, playing, sleeping. But they're also learning to relax, to trust." I watched the father dog settle onto the floor, one of the puppies immediately crawling onto his back to nap. The mother returned to her bed, but her eyes never left her family. "They've had adoption applications," Sarah continued. "Good families, people who want to give them the life they deserve." "Together?" I asked. "There's a family with a farm about an hour north. Big property. They want all 5. They read the story online, they know what happened. They said any dogs who fought that hard to stay together deserve to stay together." I felt something loosen in my chest. The puppies would grow up with their parents. They'd run through fields instead of being locked in drains. They'd know safety, love, permanence. They'd know they mattered. Before I left, the mother dog walked me to the door. She sat down in front of me, staring up with those deep brown eyes. I knelt one more time. "You're going to be okay," I told her. "All of you." She licked my hand once, gentle, deliberate, and for the first time since that storm, I believed it was true. 3 months after the flood, I went back to visit them. The rescue organization had placed the entire family together, something they said they almost never do. But after everything that happened, after the story spread and people understood what those parents had endured, they made an exception. The puppies were bigger now, healthy. Their coats had filled out, their eyes bright and curious. They tumbled over each other in the yard, playing like the nightmare had never happened. But the parents remembered. The mother stayed close, always watching. The father positioned himself between the puppies and the fence, still standing guard. Even in safety, even in a home where they were loved and fed and protected, they couldn't stop being what they'd always been. Protectors, parents, survivors who chose love over escape. The foster family told me something that made my chest tight. During the first week, whenever it rained, the mother would gather all 3 puppies close and refuse to let them out of her sight. She'd press her body against theirs, creating a wall between them and the sound of water. She was still protecting them from a flood that was long over. That's when I understood what the storm had really taught me. We spend so much time celebrating rescue stories. The dramatic saves, the last-minute interventions, the heroes who arrive just in time. And those matter. Of course they matter. But that's not what saved these dogs. What saved them was that they never gave up on each other. The parents could have run. Every survival instinct they had was screaming at them to flee, to find higher ground, to save themselves from the rising water. No one would have blamed them. Nature doesn't judge self-preservation. But they didn't run. They stood in a flood, soaked and shaking and terrified, watching their babies drown behind bars they couldn't break. And they refused to leave. They refused to let their children die alone. They chose to drown together rather than survive apart. That's not instinct. That's love. And it's the kind of love that doesn't make headlines until someone stops long enough to witness it. I think about that moment a lot. Kneeling in the rain, hands bleeding from rusted metal, watching those parents stand guard while their world fell apart. I think about the rope tied around the grate, the calculated cruelty, the person who thought a storm could erase evidence of evil. But evil underestimated love. Because love doesn't run when things get hard. It doesn't calculate odds or weigh risks. It doesn't save itself and hope for the best. Love stays. Love stands in the flood and refuses to move. Love presses its nose against the bars and breathes hope into the darkness. The person who abandoned these dogs thought he could make them disappear. He thought nature would do his dirty work. He thought no one would notice, no one would care, no one would risk themselves for animals he'd decided were disposable. He was wrong. Not because I happened to drive down that street. Not because I happened to stop. Not because I happened to have a metal rod in my truck. He was wrong because those parents refused to abandon their children. And that refusal, that stubborn, desperate, beautiful choice to stay, is what gave them all a second chance. I stood in that yard 3 months later, watching the family play in the sunshine, and realized something that still breaks me open. They weren't saved because someone found them. They were saved because they never abandoned each other. And sometimes that's the only thing that matters. Sometimes love is the only rescue we need. If this story changed something in you, then prove it. Subscribe to this channel. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to remember what loyalty actually looks like. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and which moment hit you the hardest. Because if stories like this matter to you, then this channel needs to survive. And it only survives if you choose to be part of it. Don't just watch and disappear. Be the person who stayed. See you in the next story.